Hello, everybody. Good morning, good evening, and good afternoon, wherever you are, and welcome to webinar 5 of 6 from our higher ed series at HolonIQ. It's wonderful to see still some new faces, some familiar faces, some of you coming back for more after having attended 4 webinars already, so that's great to see you all here. Thank you. And as you may expect by now, it's an absolutely action-packed session here. The slides are dripping with data as usual and full of insights. So really looking forward to taking you through those. You may have noticed we've given Beth a week off. She's been working very hard and we have gained a Lauren. Lauren is based in Oxford out of the UK. He's our head of solutions. Hi, Lauren. Yep. And following Lauren, after he's spoken, we will hear from Maria. Hello, Maria.
Hello.
And then Pat's going to bring it on home at the end.
Hey, everybody.
So we are very much looking forward to getting stuck in. Just before we do, just to situate you in today, this is, as I said, webinar 5 of 6 from part 1 in our focus on higher education this year. Part 1's been a real deep dive into what's happening in higher education around the world. As you can see, just by running your eye over those on the right, we've gone through digital transformation, micro and alternative credentials, OPMs, MOOCs. Now we're landing in international higher education. And if you join us in a couple of weeks, you'll be here for a look ahead to 2025. Parts 2 and 3 are equally fascinating. We'll be doing some one-on-ones with global digital leaders for part 2 of the series, and then part 3 back into the university institutions for some super interesting case studies. A little bit about HolonIQ. If you've come in and you don't already know them, we are a global education intelligence company, trusted source of education marketing intelligence, and we do a lot of open source frameworks, which you'll see one of at the beginning of this. I'm going to take you through the Higher Education Digital Capability Framework to support education innovation. Many customers from government around the world, from institutions, investors and organizations, informing decisions from not just higher education, but right from early childhood through to lifelong learning and education. And customers really all over the world, as you'll probably see if you scroll through, if you see who's in this webinar, relying on insights and data for decision making. So it's not just fun and pretty, it absolutely informs decisions that matter. The agenda for today, we are going to be moving fast, so pens at the ready. I'm going to start off with the Higher Education Digital Capability Framework and situate what we're talking about today within that framework. Then I'm going to pass over to Lauren, who's going to take us through some of the global flows in international education. From Lauren to Maria on digital and structural trends in international education, and then to Pat for the models and market moves that are happening. And then we will let you go. A little housekeeping just before I go into mine. Just have a look around your screen if you haven't come in before. You may see at the top right a little bell, which we strongly advise you click on and mute. Once the chat gets going, which we invite you to come into and say hello, it's going to ding every time. So if you mute that, you'll have a more peaceful session. And speaking of chat and questions and polls, these have become very, very interactive webinars, and we love the questions that you're adding in and the chat. There are probably about somewhere between 4 and 6 polls to take part in, so don't sit back, this is not passive. Pens and brains at the ready. Okay, so starting off with the open source framework, this is our anchor point for the higher education thinking. And if you haven't been through it before, just a quick introduction or refresher. It's a framework that's based around the learner lifecycle, which has been a really, really important aspect for us to consider in higher education. It's a really handy way of looking both at the different digital capabilities that learners need, but also across an institution. And so many of the things that we've been looking at in higher education, they require every single part or many parts of the institution to come together and to be speaking the same language and to be understanding concepts of digital capabilities in the same way to be able to do digital transformation effectively. So this framework has essentially 4 dimensions, reading left to right, from demand and discovery to learning design, to learner experience, to work and lifelong learning. And if you're a visual person, you might want to actually take this and loop it back around and bring lifelong work and lifelong learning and all of the insights from that back around to demand and discovery. It is a life cycle. Within each of those are what should be some fairly familiar functions and capabilities, from product strategy and marketing and recruitment through to curriculum design, digital content, subject matter, into the campus, whether it's virtual or a face-to-face campus with academic administration, learning and experience, student life and assessment, and then into work and lifelong learning with work-integrated learning, career planning, industry and business engagement, and alumni and continuing education. And as well as left to right, you can read the framework from top to bottom. Some people are staying at the very top level and just looking at it more holistically as a whole. You might stay quite shallow and look at capabilities from that level. Some people that we're working with are going deep into one of the dimensions or domains. So learning design teams, for example, are picking apart those capability boxes and trying to understand in which ways they are applicable to the digital transformation projects that they're doing. Moving on from that, a really important aspect of the higher education digital capability framework has been what you actually do with it. And every week we are hearing about and talking to people who are doing different things with it, whether they're just bringing it into a meeting, whether they're bringing it into strategic planning and doing their own things with it, but also using tools like the self-assessment, which goes with it, which assesses the 16 domains, to then inform priorities and the strategic decisions and digital choices that you're making. And the final thing we do before we go into the meat of the presentation is we look at that framework with today's topic in mind. So thinking about international education from an institution's point of view, thinking about digital transformation. The grey boxes are not necessarily irrelevant, but the coloured boxes are where there is particular attention for this topic. So if you were here 2 weeks ago or 4 weeks ago when we were speaking about MOOCs and OPMs, you'll have noticed a lot more colour in the learning design sections, for example, and in some of the industry and business engagement parts for work and lifelong learning. And now if you kind of sit back and squint again, you'll see lots more green and lots more pink. So there's lots of challenges for the demand and discovery dimension in international education, for example. Lots of new questions about product strategy and customer needs, questions about marketing processes that were there already, but that have been absolutely put front and center by what was happening last year. And then learner experience as well. Maria and Lauren and Pat have got some super interesting things to say about what digital means to the international learner, and it's a real head spinner thinking about how we create the right experiences as higher education institutions. And a few data qualifiers, particularly in international education. Now, I don't know if you've ever had to pull together a report that spans multiple countries looking at international education data, but it is fraught. There are issues with sources and there are issues with definitions. There are few and far, well, there's certainly no single source of truth globally. And the really, really solid ones, they're surprisingly rare. So we've listed some of the ones that have been drawn on for the work that we're doing there. And I'm sure there'll be more. We'd love to hear your favorites. But then even definitions, I've been caught up in this myself. What is an international student? Is it about citizenship or visas or how long they're staying? What is higher education in this context? What is the unit of measure that's going into our data? Is it enrollments? Is it about full-time load? Is it about people? What are the qualification frameworks that apply? And yeah, frustratingly large and frequent reporting gaps by governments and institutions. So there's a wicked problem for somebody to solve somewhere. So there's our big caveat. Having said that about the data, our first poll is about the data. And it's a quiz. The quizzes worked so well last time that we would like to invite you. If you look again at the top right of your screen, if you're new to this interface, you'll see a little arrow pointing right. Click on that and you'll pop out, you'll be able to see some polls coming up. So our first poll or quiz is to estimate the total number of international students globally. Are we looking at 100,000, 1 million, 5 million, or 25 million? And there's our poll now. So you need to vote, and then we will see what comes up. Wow, you guys are straight in there. Okay, definitely heading for the bigger numbers. 100,000 has fallen out the window. Even 1 million, not terribly popular. Okay, so you've gone the big numbers. About 50% of you at the moment say 25 million, about 43%, about 5 million. And I love that the voting has got off to such a participatory start. You are all over that. So I'm going to hand over to Lauren to take us through the data as it stands and give us a little bit more detail and colour around the numbers in international education. Thanks, Lauren.
Thanks, Lucy. Hi, everyone. Well, you've done pretty well with your with the poll. Here is the answer. It's currently just over 5 million, and that's a number that's up hugely if we zoom right out and look at this in kind of a 40-year, 45-year time frame. So in 1975, there were well less than 1 million international students, and now there are well more than 5 million. And there's no sign of slowdown. In fact, over the first 15 years of this period, it's a 3% annual growth rate. Then that growth rate increases to 5% from 1990 all the way through the present. And one of the things that's really striking to me about this is how immune to the economic cycles it is. I mean, if you think about the 2008 financial crisis, for example, you might have expected a reduction in the number of students going abroad there as economies were hit. But we saw nothing of the sort. In fact, it actually accelerated a little bit. So, this is a big number, and as I say, one that's up a lot, including undergrads, master's students, PhDs. But looked at another way, it's actually a very small number. Many of you guessed 25 million. And in fact, if you think about the total number of students in higher education around the world, this is a very small percentage, just a few percent. And so it's very much a glass half full, glass half empty story. Why is the glass, what's filling that glass up, and what's keeping it from being filled even more? Well, it's important to think about this both in terms of the supply of students, that is the demand, the demand from students to go abroad, as well as the demand for students to come from universities. It's a complex set of factors that overall condition both the number of international student slots that universities are opening up and the number of students who want to study abroad. And here are some of those factors. I mean, from an institutional standpoint, universities have created more slots for international students and expanded the number of students who are coming to them, especially where tuition fee revenue depends upon it. And that's especially the case where international student tuition fees are unregulated, whereas domestic student fees are regulated. That's the case for public universities in the US. It's the case in the UK. And as we'll see later, especially when the state starts to pull back on its funding support for universities, universities step up in terms of the number of international students they bring in. Universities also like international students because of the diversity they provide to the educational experience. And without being too cynical about this, universities care about rankings, and many of the rankings factor in the degree of internationalism, both of students and of staff, into their rankings methodology. What about the student side? Well, students like the prestige of an international degree in many cases, or of study abroad for a shorter period. They see it as a route to good job opportunities, especially with multinational companies. On the other hand, where post-study student work visas have been hard to get, that's a disincentive for students to go abroad. And of course, going abroad for a degree is typically much more expensive than staying at home, both because domestic student fees are typically lower and because typically the countries that students come from have lower typical tuition fees than the places where they're going. Another factor is that in the developing world, in non-OECD countries, the demand for university education has grown much faster than the supply of slots. So that creates, some would say, an inhibitory effect on innovation in universities in non-OECD countries. So it keeps them sort of stuck in the ways of the past in some ways, and increases, therefore, the attractiveness of universities in the West. There are also some very important country-specific factors that have to be considered here. So where scholarship programs that governments fund to support students going abroad are created, the number of students can jump very substantially. I think, for example, of the Saudi government's scholarship program, which ran very strongly 5 to 10 years ago, or Science Without Borders in Brazil. Also, where students and families are used to spending a lot of money on education, they're more likely to spend the money to go abroad, and where governments have gotten together to create regional associations. For example, in the EU with Erasmus and the Bologna process, that has dramatically increased the flow of students, especially shorter term placements, but also students going abroad whose degrees will then be recognized when they come home. Okay, so let's look at some of the biggest countries here. So we see that China and India account for something like 25% of the global total of outbound students. So this is where the students are coming from. And the US is almost 20% of the share of where the students are going to, with other English-speaking countries, UK and Australia, close behind. The other thing that's striking here is really the diversity of it. I mean, to me, when I first looked at these numbers, if you look at where the students are coming from, I mean, everyone knows that there are huge numbers from China and India. To some people, South Korea and Germany are surprising third and fourth. And look, Nigeria, they're in fifth. So you have representatives from multiple continents here. You also have students going in very different kinds of directions. So you have some examples here of sort of non-OECD to OECD student flows. You also have some students going within region or to sort of a local power. So why is Kazakhstan and Ukraine here, for example? I mean, many of those students are going to Russia, which is why Russia is, fifth overall in terms of inbound flows. Those are kind of very contained flows within particular spheres of influence. And you also see here the power of the integration across Europe. That's why Germany and France are among the greatest senders, not because students are typically going abroad for degrees. More of those students are going abroad for shorter term placements. All right, looking at everything then, here we have a chart showing on the right-hand side all of the regions that students are coming from. That's the dark gray, labeled source flows here. And then on the left side, where are the students going to, the destination of those places. And the first thing that strikes you here really is what an incredibly complex web this is. This really underscores the point that I made earlier about how this is a genuinely global phenomenon. 5 million students and a lot of money at stake, about 100 billion in annual fee revenue. But of course, this chart has so many arcs going in so many different directions that it's hard to make much sense of at this level. So let's zoom in on some particular regions. All right, so here we see all the students coming from East Asia and the Pacific and where they're going to. So you have this kind of red or fuchsia bar that's going from East Asia here down to the US. So you see there that, a good 40% of the students coming from East Asia are going to the US, with substantial numbers going to other English-speaking countries, Australia and the UK. But actually you have also a lot of students staying within the region. So we shouldn't discount the flows within regions. from East Asia, they're going from a variety of countries, particularly to Malaysia and to Korea. How about on the inbound side, the receiving countries? Well, where are those students coming from? This shows the source of students coming to the US. And not surprisingly, we see the reverse, or the sort of mirror image of what we saw when we looked at East Asia. That is, East Asia is a big, it sends a lot of students to the US, and here we see that makes up about half of the number of students coming to the US as a whole. But there's also a lot from South Asia, largely from India. That's about another quarter. And a good chunk from the Arab states, here coming from the top. Now that's a number that a few years ago would have been even higher. I mentioned the Saudi scholarship program. And when that was really at its peak, which was some years before this, the number of students coming from Saudi Arabia to the US was in the top 5 among all source countries, and since has dropped back a bit. The other thing that's interesting about the US is that, of course, the politics of the US have buffeted international students, and the numbers have not, by 2019, so this is obviously pre-COVID, the numbers had already started to fall a little bit due to what you might call the Trump effect, so visa restrictiveness and rhetoric about America first. But overall, people's study abroad aspirations are really durable. You know, that drop was only by 1.8%, but you know, by 2019. Of course, now due to COVID, it's dropped a lot further. How about the UK? Well, the UK really punches above its weight. 11 of the top 100 universities, according to the Times Higher Education ranking, which is pretty good for a country of 60 million people. You know, strong reputation of its higher education degrees and shorter programs than in many countries that also attract people. The UK has a somewhat more diverse profile of where it sources its students. Something like a third from East Asia, a third from North America, a third from the rest of the world. And the UK had dropped a bit in terms of its share of international students before 2019, but it's now on the rebound. It topped 500,000 students for the first time just this past year, and is staying strong during COVID because it has kept its borders open to international students while other countries have shut them off. And it'll be interesting to see whether that persists once the COVID emergency is behind us. We have a couple of other countries here to look at, Australia, and then we'll look at Canada next. In some ways, they're relatively similar. So the Australia and Canada have 6 and 5 universities in the top 100 respectively. And the educational model at the undergrad level is a little bit of a hybrid between the somewhat longer, more free-form US liberal arts model and the more focused, shorter UK model. Both Australia and Canada have a large number of international students per population, so as a share of their overall sector. Australia has 25 million people, but it's number 3 overall in terms of inbound students. And its profile, in terms of where those students are coming from, is different than the previous 2 countries, the US and the UK, which you saw were pretty diverse. The lion's share coming to Australia are coming from East Asia and the Pacific. So even students who are traveling thousands of miles typically travel broadly within their region, rather than go halfway around the world. Canada, as I say, is similar in many ways. It draws most of its students from East Asia and the Pacific, especially from China, where many students cross the Pacific, and they're particularly represented in Vancouver, University of British Columbia, and in Toronto, where there's a very large expat community. And Canada has been really growing like gangbusters in recent years. It sends out a lot of very pro-immigrant, pro-student mobility signals that it instantiates, for example, in post-study work visas for students. And it's the number of international students that it's attracting is therefore up by something like 2/3 over the last 5-6 years. Okay, so as is implied by what I've said already, there's a big difference in the percentage of student populations in these different countries that are international. It's 8% on average for the top 20 destination countries, with Australia and the UK and Canada well above that. So those sectors are particularly dependent, you might say, on international students, or you might say that they're particularly welcoming to them, whereas the US somewhat less. Although the picture in the US really is not just as with anything regarding the US, not a single picture, but a tale of a very diverse sector where you have many institutions that have almost no international students, and then some that have a substantially higher percentage. And that's why, and so we talk here about dependency versus opportunity. Well, many sectors have become increasingly dependent on international students as public funding has diminished. So take the US example. Since 2008, the amount of funding going to public universities is down by 13% overall. For many universities, it's down 20 or 30%. And they've essentially just tried to replace the lost income from the state and federal government, mostly state government, with additional tuition fee income, unregulated tuition fee income from international students. Same is true in Canada. Okay, so we're ready for another poll here. 4 options in answer to the question, how will international education spring back post-COVID? So obviously a lot of students have been scared away from traveling abroad or have simply been unable to travel abroad during the pandemic. Do you expect that this will lead to a substantial duration of lower growth as students stay at home? That's number 1. Number 2, slower growth with digital, like online offerings, substituting for the traditional desire of students to travel in person. 3, that it will kind of bounce back to normal pretty quickly. Or 4, that actually we might see a burst of energy, a burst of students going overseas, pent up during the pandemic. So I'll give you a minute to submit votes. Interestingly, people are somewhat bearish. So just under half so far think it's slower growth. But interestingly, there's also a group, about 1 in 5, who think that there'll be a burst, a short to medium term boost that raises the growth rate well above the historical average. And then there's about a third that think it will bounce back. Not too many think that it will remain depressed. And I think what this reflects is that this is a group that sees online options as a really attractive and likely soon to accelerate option. So I'll hand over to Maria, who will talk more about that and other trends looking in her crystal ball.
Thanks, Lauren. Hi, everyone. It's great to see you here. Lots of great questions and chats in the comment area. Okay, so Lauren has gone through the sort of overall global flows up into 2019, and there's already been some questions about, well, what's happening in 2020, and more importantly, what might happen in the future. So let's have a quick look at that. Firstly, let's just zoom out a little bit. 5 million international students going from country to country. That's the trend, in history. That's about 100 billion of annual tuition, but another 4 times in value add to the economies in which international students go. This is a really important point. A lot of institutions have pretty high dependency on international tuition, even though the numbers are relatively small compared with overall numbers of students in higher education. Tuition is high, and that's meaningful for many institutions and economies. So the question is, during and after COVID, if there's 5 million students who traditionally traveled from one country to the other, what about the 20 million? There's about 1 in 4 who make it, who want to study, who can study. What about the 20 million others who would have liked to, but just didn't quite make it. So that's all those students who didn't quite make the academic cut, who can't quite afford the price of traveling and studying overseas for 3 or 4 or 5 years. What happens to those students? Is there a possibility that we can tap into that 20 million students who would like to study overseas who can't, through some sort of digital models or blended, or, you know, can we tap into this demand? Because the potential there is pretty huge. So that's some of the things that the people in international education are thinking about, and not just people or, you know, traditional sort of players in international education, but new players as well. And so let's think about that as we're going through these sort of options for the future and how digital might impact. As a bit of a case study, Coursera is a MOOC provider who you would know, not traditionally thought of course, as international education, although 62 million registered users outside their headquarters of the US. Is that international education? Not in the traditional definition, but let's start thinking a bit differently about what international education is, who international students are, and what type of models that may be unfolding as time goes on, in particular the way that technology can start impacting that experience. Looking at the global post-secondary market, it's huge. Obviously, it's a $2.2 trillion market. That's the sort of regular higher education. We are expecting tuition deflation that's been growing over the last however many years. It's growing at 1% CAGR. It's a slow growing. It's huge but slow growing. International education, as Lauren pointed out, it's a $100 billion market. It's a 5% CAGR. But look at online degrees and alternative and micro credentials. That's growing much faster, even though it's tiny compared to these others. And so growth rates of different models is important, and even these models are not mutually exclusive. Online degrees, international education, micro credentials, models are forming and reforming. And so we'll be keeping an eye on that for sure, but growth rates are important. There are 3 key stakeholders with different drivers for international education, as you all know. So learners, they want high value credentials, they want knowledge and learning, they want life experience, social professional networks, they want migration outcomes and career outcomes. So learners have, international students have particular sort of drivers for studying abroad. Universities have particular drivers too. They want internationalization of the campus, they want a diverse student body, they want additional students and they want more revenue, and they want economic outcomes for the region, of course. And governments, they want that value-added economic output I talked about before. They want a diversified education sector, and perhaps most importantly, they want skilled talent in their country. And so there's these 3 different stakeholders. Their actions and interactions and their drivers interact with each other to have a big impact on the way in which international education unfolds. So the way COVID has happened, well, is happening, and all universities and international students have been severely disrupted. So the global flows are not happening. This is not just in education, but, you know, COVID-19 is expected definitely to have a lasting impact on patterns of consumption. If you think about education as a service, it's it's consumption, not just from consumers or learners in this case, but the way the industry responds and the actions of government. And so let's think about this model in terms of how are international students finding the online learning experience, which they've been forced into? What's happening there? What are they thinking about that? Are they having an awesome experience? If they are, would that contribute potentially to some changes in the way international education occurs in the future? What about universities or providers? How have they responded to this? What models are unfolding? What are they doing to respond to COVID, in particular in digital? And governments, has the government provided support? What have they done with regulation? So the actions and interactions of these 3 stakeholders through COVID will impact potentially the way in which some elements of international education unfold into the future. So let's just have a quick look firstly at the international students. How have they experienced online? How have they experienced digital? And so this is drawn from a number of sources, and it's an interesting picture. One, survey of thousands and thousands of students, 70% surveyed and said, well, the quality of online is the best imaginable, excellent, or good. And that could mean a number of things. It's okay. They're going okay. Now, that's not to say that international students would say, okay, let's just keep learning online, but it's okay. Another survey said, well, okay, actually, higher ed student experience has gone way down, really, really not very good. Interviews with sort of providers in this space have shown in some cases that students haven't been disadvantaged in their learning from studying online. They have adapted. And that's interesting. Students in the UK, in a different survey, UK were okay with the student experience of online, but the whole area of wellbeing, mental health, social connection, that was a problem. Others are saying, well, you know, students are adapting and they're used to learning. They're used to doing lots of things online. And so this is possible. In other reactions, international students are just really eager to get back to campus. They're happy to quarantine, but they just want to go back to that immersive experience. And then, you know, sort of in other, it's not just about their online experience, but their perceptions of different sort of different markets. So there definitely is, and Lauren mentioned this before, definitely there's improved perceptions of the US amongst students, and that will impact over time the way in which choices are made in terms of international study. I want to hear from you. How have your international students responded to online learning over the past year? Do they love it? Let's open that poll. Are they generally enjoying the experience? They sort of accept it, but actually they just want to get back to in-person learning, or they really, really dislike it and they've been negatively impacted. What's your thought on that, given your experience of international students? And so I'm just having a look at that poll now. So they accept it, but want to get back to in-person learning. I mean, this is to be expected. These are generally traditional international students. They signed up for on campus and they want to get back to it. And so that's about 70%. They accept it. It's okay temporarily, but actually they just want to get back. So that's nearly three-quarters, more than three-quarters of your experience, which I think, you know, I think that's what we're seeing in the market. How are providers responding? What are they doing? How are providers responding to this emergency situation of COVID? Interesting to see and to think about what might stick. So let's start with on-ramps. We're seeing actually a lot of activity in this space. Online pathways, whether direct online pathways, programs, they're just pivoting to online and they seem to be going okay. There's evidence in the market that students are enjoying it. I mean, it depends, of course. Online is not all the same, but online pathways programs are happening through either individual providers or through consortium models, in-country consortium models. Universities are partnering with MOOC providers to offer taster courses and prep students for international physical relocation when the time comes. So there's quite a bit of activity in this space. Will online pathways, if it's accepted by the market, i.e. students, will that stay? My thoughts are, and what I'm seeing is that actually, of course, there'll still be in-person pathways, but actually I think we will start to see some more acceptance of online pathways, whether it be through consortiums like we're seeing or directly. There are a number of models where students are starting online and finishing on campus. So something like 1,000 business school programs around the world, half of them already are offering online start with in-person transition, 1/4 offering their students to start fully online. So universities and business schools in this case, in this example, but universities are saying, okay, you can start online and then we can finish you on campus, or you can start on campus and we can finish you online, usually the former. Transnational learner support, this is interesting because it's sort of splitting up the learner experience. So students are in country. This is international students. They're in country. They're doing their lectures or classes online with their lecturer from their home, from the international country. But actually they're missing that learning experience with their peers, and learning hubs in country are starting to be built, study spaces. So for example, Study Group has just recently partnered with WeWork in China to give students a place to go to study with their peers, to do group assignments, to get to the internet, to have a comfortable place. You know, these sorts of models, this is not technology per se, but it's sort of transnational learner support. And this is interesting, and let's think about whether this is going to be an acceptable model or partly an acceptable model as time goes on. Maybe attracting that second layer I was talking about, not the 5 million, but the 20 million. And then we're seeing sort of in-country blended, where, you know, the institution is running online lectures, live online lectures with, you know, students in country and university lecturers in their home country, but in country there are in-person tutorials, or and that could be through partnerships with institutions or with a private partner. There are university consortium models, regional and global. We're seeing that quite a bit, and not really yet for international students because we're not quite there yet given COVID, but definitely virtual internships and job placements and so on like that. There's lots of models around. So providers are responding with interesting models that may or may not stick as time goes on. It may not impact that 5 million students, but actually it may grow a whole new market for blended or, you know, part online, part in-country type models. And then finally, let's just very quickly have a look at how governments have responded. I mean, interesting, really super interesting. Lauren mentioned before, Canada is going gangbusters in terms of offering post-study work rights to any student who's studying with a Canadian institution online fully. It'll all count towards their post-study work rights. Come to Canada after you can work for any employer, work any location in Canada, and then after a year you can apply for PR. So governments, and this is the same in other countries too, like Australia and so on. But you know, governments want talent in their country, and so the incentive for them is to get international students to come to their country. And so as long as that sort of incentive remains, there will still be, you know, this massive flow of students going across the world. We've seen sort of favourable policies in China, with the steady growth in international students inbound into China. European Commission just launched its, you know, 26, I think it's actually 28 billion euro Erasmus Plus program for the next 5 or 6 years, and that's into European flows. And, you know, UAE's got a golden visa. There's all sorts of regulation and policy, but mainly it is to attract students physically to come to the country. And so that will remain a very big deal for a large proportion of international students. Maybe governments may continue to extend this eligibility for online learning, counting towards post-study work rights, maybe partly, not fully. So we'll see how that unfolds. I'd like to understand from you, is online learning likely to become a core feature of most international education models in the future? What do you think? It may not be that 5 million, but what about the 20 million and the next layer down? What do you think about that? Let's have a look. Okay, so definitely yes, so far is 3/4 of the responses. That's really interesting. So people are pretty bullish on the impact, the sort of pivot that COVID's made and the longer lasting impact of some component of digital or online. So that's 70% of you are saying definitely yes, and a further 28% are saying probably. So that's a sort of super interesting response. I'm going to hand over to Pat to talk about models and moves.
Thanks, Maria. All right, we're picking up the pace and we're racing home, so hang in there. I'm going to tell a little bit of a story just to get us all together to prep you for the last poll. It's a once upon a time story, and it's going to help you build a picture if you're not already familiar with the international education landscape. So once upon a time, there was an international student who wanted to study at an international university. But one of the key issues, as you've heard here, for the most part for international education is immigration. And so thereabouts came the agent, which I'm sure you've heard a lot about if you're not even in international education, facilitating and helping the student to complete all of the paperwork and to gain entrance into the universities that they prefer. In many instances, students are required to pass a language learning test. And for the most part, will attend physical language learning training as part of that. There's a burgeoning pathway industry that has been built over the last few decades, again, assisting students with a bridge into university. That might be through foundation programs or first year programs or other programs that are helping a student transition into international higher education in that market. Schools have become involved. Many schools are looking for their students around the world to attend international universities and are a big part of the recruiting of international education. Thereby, there has been more agents focused on bringing those students, connecting with those schools, connecting with the universities, and again, picking on Lauren's point, like essentially servicing the supply and servicing the demand and bringing all of that together. More agents, sub-agents, master agents, the agent landscape has just grown and grown over the years as the industry has grown as well. We've seen local universities get involved in arrangements like twinning that Maria mentioned, where an international university will partner with a local university and essentially help a student again transition from study in their home market to study overseas and then returning back to their market as well. We've seen transnational campuses where universities around the world essentially create hubs and campuses in those target markets. And through the digital transition, we've started to see what you might think of as digital transnational programs as well. MOOCs and credit recognized pathways are likely to become a massive part of this landscape. Credit recognition, starting programs onshore digitally before moving into those markets as well. We've seen the rise of platform aggregators and matches in any industry around the world where there is an enormous complex amount of supply and enormous complex amount of demand. We see a role for platform aggregators matches who are in some part trying to displace agents, in some part supporting agents, in some part connecting agents, and really bringing that ecosystem about. Throughout all of this are concepts like gap years and study abroad that we've seen as well, where a student would like to complete a small part of their study overseas. Again, some wouldn't define this as international education, others would see it as core, and gap years as well, especially through COVID, we kind of saw the prompt of that. Digital language learning really emerged through COVID. If you haven't heard the story about Duolingo's language test and the acceptance by universities around the world, you should really check that out as we start to see that. We've seen virtual tours. Again, COVID stopped us physically attending, but it didn't stop the demand. And so there were organizations whose sole job it was to help students explore what the physical environment of a university was on the other side of the world, but from their home market. And then virtual internships, again, offering students, international students, away from their home market of experiencing internships in that destination market, either as part of their destination program or the like. And of course, employers, as with all of higher education, are becoming very, very significant players in whether it's credentialing or practical components of the programs, and a higher consciousness that a job outcome is, for the most part, what students are seeking as part of this. As we wrap up, here is a very small selection of some of the, if you like, if that was a once upon a time, these are some of the stars of the show as part of that landscape as well. Again, it's not exhaustive, it's not comprehensive, but it's some of the names that, for those of you who are in the space, that are supporting students and supporting universities in all sorts of ways. To pick on a very few examples, I'm sure you've heard of study portals, helping students explore options around the world. Enrollee is a team based out of the UK, helping with the complexity of the CAS admissions, visa processes as well. We've seen teams like BridgeU was acquired by Kaplan last year, connecting schools and learners from secondary education with universities with guidance and counselling for careers in higher education. Minerva was a fascinating model, which was something between international education and online education. Amerigo helping students go early. We've seen teams like Chiafo out of Southeast Asia raise money. Apply Board, the unicorn on this page, an edtech company valued at over $1 billion, very much fulfilling that matchmaker platform. Adventus doing something adjacent based out of Asia, but again, tackling that problem really differently. IDP is the only listed company on this map here. Extraordinarily large, connecting learners and universities all around the world. Very much a bellwether because of how much information they have to disclose being a listed company around the world. Companies like Sanam S4 and Grok providing that enabling infrastructure for people as they reach into market. You can see Pathway players here as well. UVisit was a company acquired by EAB prior to COVID, helping students explore campuses through virtual reality and augmented reality. I'm going to stop there and I'll be in trouble for sure for missing a few of the key players on this map. We'd love to learn more if we did miss any here, but nonetheless, there are a whole bunch of plays and platforms happening. The last poll, and thank you for hanging in there, is imagine you are an investor, imagine you are a government, imagine you are looking for social and economic outcomes in international education, but you want to innovate, you want to do something differently. You're not just backing the normal flows that we've seen grow over the last 50 years. What would you back to achieve, again, both an economic outcome and a social outcome? Firstly, would it be about digitizing process and productivity, about streamlining and simplifying the complexity and the process in international education? Would you be positioning yourself in the flow of students, an aggregator, a matcher, a marketplace, bringing all of those components together as a platform in the middle of all those complex flows? Would you be thinking more digital in terms of delivery? Something digital, something transnational. I'm thinking OPM meets branch campus, using digital to augment and extend international education? Or would you be thinking about non-academic digital services? We're talking about an enormous amount of students and complexity around the world, and we've seen big use cases for everything from wellness to work, internships, apprenticeships, practicums, all sorts of services that are non-academic supporting the student as well. So hopefully that poll is open. Please jump in, and I'm just submitting my vote. Okay. All right. So digital transnational OPM meets branch campus is over 1/3. So 40%-ish. Digitizing process and productivity is very popular, just under 30%. Flow aggregator matcher marketplace is interesting. It's 25%. I would have guessed that might have been a little bit higher, but there's still a really strong segment in non-academic digital services, wellness to work. Just going to let that settle, give you the results, and then hand off to Lucy to wrap up. Thanks for hanging in there. Look, it looks like digital transnational OPM meets branch campus is really strong. It's more than 1/3 of responses. It's the leading response. But I mean, digitizing process and productivity isn't that far behind. Neither is flow aggregator matcher marketplace. Those three are tied. Digital transnationals definitely taking the lead. Thank you so much for sharing where you would pick to play. Over to you, Lucy.
Thank you, Pat. I'm just going to let you know that we will be back again in 2 weeks' time with the final in this 6-part series. So don't miss that. It's going to be an absolute cracker. And please, if you don't want to miss anything, join the Global Network. It's super quick and easy to do. The link is at the bottom there. And you really won't miss anything. You'll get write-ups of these webinars so you can go back and review what happened. Speaking of which, you will get a recording probably in about 60 seconds straight to your inbox, so you can go back and look at those bits of data in a lot more detail. Thank you, Maria. Thank you, Lauren. Thank you, Pat. Thanks, everybody, for getting up early or staying up late, and enjoy the rest of your evenings and days. It's been an absolute blast, as always.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, folks.